You need to think deeper about something. Tucker Carlson's latest appearance on Joe Rogan has started a flurry of heated debate about one of the most complex moral dilemmas in human history. Were the nuclear bombings of Japan in World War II morally justified? That's a question that has driven a wedge between the online conservative space, and over the last week, many names have piled up on X, especially the Daily Wire and Jeremy Boring, locking horns with people like Candace Owens and PBD. But I want to make sure you have the full context, so watch this clip of what Tucker said before I tell you more about it.
Well, you could say the same about the atomic bomb, right?
Yes, you could.
And you could say that we have to develop it like Oppenheimer felt before the Nazis did.
I love that. How'd that work? How'd that work?
Well,
I love, by the way, that people on my side, I'll just admit it, on the right, have spent the last 80 years defending dropping nuclear weapons on civilians. Like, are you joking?
Right.
That's just like prima facie evil.
Yeah.
If you can't, if we hadn't done that, then this, that, the other thing, that was actually a great savings. Like, no, it's wrong to drop nuclear weapons on people. And if you find yourself arguing that it's a good thing to drop nuclear weapons on people, then you are evil.
Anyone that tells with a moral certitude that they know what they would do in a moral quandary like this one is likely deluding themselves, and that's what I want you to remember. See, hosts over at the Daily Wire have seemed to develop exactly that. The terrible pragmatics of nuclear weapons as historical contingency of war should always have been accompanied by a recognition of how they're antithetical to every principle of morality. I think that's a separation that's critical to make, and then there's something else that's just as important. You've seen people, especially in things like the current Israel versus Hamas conflict, try to compare large-scale military action to what happened back in World War II. But what you can't afford to forget is how many fail-safes the human race has tried to put in place after the 1940s to make sure mass atrocities like that have never happened again. In fact, that's what the Geneva Convention was for back in 1949. So in that retrospect, it's truly something to see the moral certainty coming from the Daily Wire when CEO Jeremy Boring tweeted this in reference to Tucker Carlson's remarks. And I quote, "People who deny the moon landing or suggest America's evil for its use of atomic weapons against Imperial Japan or who say George Bush was behind 9/11 actually hate this country." Notice the rigidity in that statement and the complete difference to governments. That's not something you'd expect from the political right. Apart from the fact that in the entire podcast, Tucker doesn't even make any reference to Bush being behind the September 11 attacks, it's truly something to see a flat-out label of hating the country for believing differently, no matter how absurd you think it is. That's a game that the far left has played for long using the label conspiracy theory, and now it seems to be driving a wedge between the right itself. But clearly Jeremy wasn't going to let that go so easily, and even the head of a platform that's arguably becoming a rival to Daily Wire, Valuetainment, came forward when Patrick Bet-David came after Jeremy saying this, and I quote, "Jeremy isn't the entire premise of being a critical thinker to question things. Some of the best podcasters and influencers are those who ask questions no one else is asking. Being anti-establishment is to question the establishment's motives, no?" To this, Jeremy replied something that I still haven't been able to make sense of. Quote, "It is not critical thinking to say that America never landed on the moon or that George Bush orchestrated the 9/11 attacks. It's a rejection of critical thinking." Well, first of all, the George Bush part was never brought up in any discussion in the Tucker podcast conversation. And secondly, critical thinking can't be boxed up into sets of opinions. Critical thinking questions anything and everything, Jeremy. It takes a hammer and chisel to chip away at every popular narrative. You don't need to end up a particular way to qualify as a critical thinker. This actually seems to be a new common orthodoxy among the Daily Wire, which is why Patrick Bet-David had to shoot back with this reply. And I quote, "I understand your point. However, I'm not a Christian because I broke bread with Jesus. I've never met him face to face. That requires a level of faith that I'm willing to risk taking. But it also takes faith to believe that we landed on the moon or someone's involvement in the 9/11 attacks. Having that level of unwavering faith in the US government is what I'm not willing to risk. History does not favor blind faith in any government." Hit the nail on the head with that one and close the lid on the needless contention. And by the way, this attitude isn't limited to Jeremy Boring himself, but seems to have enveloped much of the Daily Wire, judging from what Ben Shapiro said about Tucker's remarks on his show.
How exactly would you justify? Why are we talking about how many lives it would save? It's just wrong to drop the bomb. Well, no, actually, if you end up saving more lives than are cost by the dropping of the atomic bomb, then it is morally justified to drop the atomic bomb. And that happens to be the reality of the situation. So why is Tucker just abandoning the moral equation here at all? What is he doing here? That's what's sort of fascinating. Now, I think to understand what Tucker's doing here, you have to understand that this particular interview included a lot of conspiratorial thinking.
The question is, where's that certainty coming from? Why can't there be a degree of humility at the question itself, considering there are millions of lives that hanged in the balance either way? I actually liked what Ben's colleague Matt Walsh said on this, calling the decision to drop the atomic bomb one of the most morally complex dilemmas in history, and admitting that none of us will ever be put into a position like this and never know the tremendous pressure of making that call. There's a gratefulness and humility that it inspires. For some reason, the Daily Wire has changed in the regard a lot, almost taking on a similar antagonistic political stance that's way too sure of itself, similar to the woke left it criticizes. That's unfortunate, but ultimately good to spur on the conversation on the right. That's what we saw when even former Daily Wire host Candace Owens responded to Jeremy Boring, tearing down what she calls Tucker derangement syndrome and introducing some vital quotes into the discussion. She also said, and I quote, "Needless to say, every American has a right to evaluate whether the drastic measure of dropping a nuke or a non-military target in a country that had been on the defense for 2 years, plus negotiating their surrender was necessary. You may ultimately conclude it was or was not, but your right to think critically and express your views is about as American as it gets." And I couldn't agree more. Anyone that's trying to shut you out of the conversation seldom wants the best for you or the whole country. And if you're not allowed to question established government narratives over perhaps the most important decision that a single person has ever made in history, then you're not really anti-establishment or against the status quo. I think Tucker Carlson in that interview also made some more sobering points about the entire idea of nuclear weapons.
With that in mind, like, why would you want nuclear weapons? It's like just a mindless, childish sort of intellectual exercise to justify, like, oh no, it's really good because someone else will get it. How about no? How about like spending all of your effort to prevent this from happening? Would you kill baby Hitler, famously?
Right.
So I don't know why we're sitting back and allowing this to happen if we really believe it will extinguish the human race or enslave the human race.
That would be a world we could aim for, but unfortunately that's never happening and could never happen. Any new technology introduces a race between nations, companies, and individuals to be the first one to perfect them, and America's development of the bomb was an unavoidable race once the Russians or Germans started working on them in the early 1900s. But nonetheless, it's a sentiment that's shared a lot by people wishing for a time when every new conflict wouldn't bring with it the risk of escalating to global nuclear conflict, like what we're seeing right now with the wars in Ukraine or Israel. Tucker also expressed this in a conversation with Lex Friedman.
Obviously, it's like completely demonic and everyone pretends like it's great. Nuclear weapons are evil.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
The use of them is evil, and the technology itself is evil. And in my opinion, it's just like, if you can't, that's just so obvious. And that's what I'm saying is, like, I'm not against all technology. I took a shower this morning.
Mm-hmm.
It was powered by an electric pump, heated by a water heater. Like, I loved it. I sat in an electric sauna. Like, I'm not against all technology, obviously. But the mindless worship of technology?
Sure. Mindless worship of anything is pretty bad.
It's hard to argue against the fact that nuclear weapons are evil, but life can sometimes be about picking the lesser of two evils. What we can do in a relatively peaceful time is to be grateful we just don't stand at that juncture now, and always be questioning the government and history for the narratives and stories that it tries to tell us. That's what contributed to the world war that led to the nuclear bomb in the first place, and we'd be best advised not to repeat that. I'm reminded of an incredible quote that I'd like to end this video with, and I quote, "Studying history will sometimes disturb you. Studying history will sometimes upset you. Studying history will sometimes make you furious. If studying history always makes you feel proud and happy, you're probably not studying history."